If you ever drank in a Tyneside pub or a working men's club in Durham or an American college bar in the 90s, you remember Newcastle Brown Ale, poured from the bottle into a half-pint schooner, topped up to keep the head, drunk after a shift in the yards or the pit. By the late 1990s, it was the most widely distributed alcoholic product in every pub and every off-licence in Britain, exported to 41 countries, the bottled flagship of the country's last large independent brewer. It survived the Great Depression. It survived the Second World War. It survived the collapse of Tyneside shipbuilding and the closure of the Durham coalfields. It survived takeover bids the city's drinkers personally beat back with posters. And then, after 78 years of brewing in Newcastle, the brewery on Gallowgate went silent. How does a beer named after a city, legally bound to that city, end up brewed everywhere except the city? What really happened on the Tyne? Chapter 1. The Smell over the Gallowgate. This is a story about a smell, and a soldier, and a city that loved them both. For 3/4 of a century, on certain mornings, the air around Gallowgate carried something specific. Sweet, malty, warm, even on a cold day. Anyone walking past St. James's Park knew, without being told, what it was. The Broon was on the boil. That smell came from a beer designed by a Burton-born war hero called James Herbert Porter, who came to Newcastle in 1909 as a 17-year-old apprentice and left 6 decades later as a commander of the British Empire, and who, somewhere between those two dates, in a brewery beside a football ground, made a beer that he initially thought was a failure. That smell is gone now. The brewery is gone. Where the malt vapour used to drift across the city stands a glass and steel science city. The spark, the catalyst, the biosphere, built on the grave of the building that made Newcastle Brown Ale. To understand what was taken from Newcastle, you have to understand what Porter built, and to understand what Porter built, you have to understand the city he built it in. In the 1920s, the northeast of England was the workshop of an empire. On the Tyne itself, the great shipyards, Swan Hunter at Wallsend, Armstrong Whitworth at Elswick, later Vickers Armstrong, turned out warships and merchantmen for half the world. Up the Wear in Sunderland, more yards. Inland, the Durham and Northumberland coalfields fed coke ovens and gasworks and railway tenders. Heavy engineering, armaments, locomotives sent from Tyneside to India, to Argentina, to South Africa, painted in the liveries of railways the people building them would never visit. This was a region whose self-image was built around making things that mattered. Newcastle breweries occupied the brewing equivalent of that landscape. It had been formed in 1890 from the merger of 5 separate companies, John Barras and Company, founded in 1770 and originally based, by an accident of geography, on the Gateshead side of the river, Carr Brothers and Carr, the 2 J.J. and W.H. Allison concerns, and Swinburne and Company. The brewery sat on Gallowgate, next to where Newcastle United's home ground would eventually rise. Brewing had been done on that site since 1868. 5 companies, 1 address, 1 purpose. Into that company, in 1909, walked a 17-year-old from Burton-upon-Trent. Porter came from brewing royalty. His father, John Herbert Porter, and his grandfather James had run James Porter and Son in Burton, the great brewing town of the Midlands, where every well went down through gypsum-rich water that gave Burton ales their character. He was the family's 3rd generation. The Newcastle brewers brought him north to learn what an entirely different brewing tradition could teach a young man who already thought he knew the trade. He had been there 5 years when the war came. Porter served, like so many of his generation, in trenches he could not have imagined when he learned to take a gravity reading in his father's Burton brewhouse. He commanded the 6th Battalion of the North Staffordshire Regiment. He won the Distinguished Service Order. And then, because in the dark mathematics of that war, the same act of gallantry could not realistically be performed twice, he won the DSO with Bar. He came home alive when so many didn't. In 1924, with the post-war world hungry for cheap bottled beer and the older breweries struggling to adapt, the directors of Newcastle breweries asked him to do something specific. "Make us a popular new bottled ale," they said. "Use the most modern techniques. Bottle it. Sell it." What he made 3 years later became the symbol of a city. He thought he'd got it wrong. Chapter 2. The Colonel's Mistake. The directors gave him the brief, but not the recipe. That part was his. His and the chief chemist's, a man called Archie Jones, whose name has worn away in the way company chemists' names do, but who stood beside Porter through 3 years of trial and error in the Tyne Brewery's experimental room. What's striking, in retrospect, is how often they got it wrong. The recipe varied so widely between attempts that rival brewers, sniffing around, couldn't make sense of what was being attempted. Porter later admitted as much. They had been thrown off the scent because there was no settled scent to follow. Some batches were stronger, some lighter, some had different malts, some used different yeasts. The two men were chasing something they could not yet describe. What Porter was actually chasing, in his own words, was Bass. Bass, the famous Burton Pale Ale, brewed in his hometown, whose red triangle had been the first ever registered trademark in the United Kingdom, and whose name was, across the British Empire in the 1880s, possibly the most widely consumed beer name on earth. Porter was the Burton boy, made good in Newcastle, and what he wanted to make was a northern reply to the beer he had grown up around. He wanted a bottled ale that could stand beside Bass on a wholesaler's price list and not look provincial. He didn't get Bass, he got something else. The first advertisement for Newcastle Brown Ale ran in the Newcastle Daily Journal on the 25th of April, 1927. The price was 9 shillings for a dozen pint bottles, a premium price set by a brewer who knew exactly what his costs were and intended to be paid for them. The original gravity was 1060. The alcohol level, in its earliest iteration, was around 6.25%, settling, in the decades that followed, to the 4.7% that became its familiar strength. Bottled, brown, sweet on the palate, strong enough to be felt. Within months, it had swept the bottled beer world. In 1928, at the International Brewers Exhibition, Newcastle Brown Ale took gold. The medals are still depicted on the bottle label nearly a century later. That same year, an artist working for the brewery added something to the design, a 5-pointed star, blue against pale, with a silhouette of the Newcastle skyline behind it and, drawn into the silhouette, the unmistakable arch of the Tyne Bridge, itself only opened that year, a steel rainbow over the river, the most photographed object in the northeast. The Blue Star's 5 points were not random. They stood for the 5 companies that had merged to form Newcastle Breweries in 1890. The Barras line, the Carrs, the 2 Allisons, Swinburne, a genealogy compressed into a piece of design that millions of people would later carry in their pockets, on their shirts, as a beer mat under their pint. The one and only, the brewery called it. There was no second beer of its type. The slogan would last for the rest of the century. There is a story, told in Tyneside for as long as anyone has been telling brewery stories, that on the day after Newcastle Brown went on sale, the local police phoned the brewery and asked, with as much politeness as policemen could muster in 1927, whether the ale could be made a little weaker. The cells, they said, were full. The strength of the beer, in combination with its drinkability and the absence of any history that might have warned drinkers to slow down, had put more Geordies in the lockup overnight than the night sergeant could remember. Whether the call happened exactly as told, whether it happened at all, is a question for folklorists. What's not in dispute is that the beer arrived with force. Sunderland's Vaux Brewery pushed its double maxim harder against the new arrival from up the coast. Other regional brewers tried and tried and tried. None of them had Porter's particular combination: the hops, the malts, the chocolatey roasted character, the colour set by caramel, the specific finish that drinkers in working men's clubs across the northeast had decided was the only finish they wanted. The beer that became, in time, the proudest symbol of Newcastle had been created by a Burton-born war hero who thought he'd failed to copy somebody else's beer. That's the first oddity in the story. The second is that the very thing he thought made it wrong, the way it diverged from the Bass model he'd been chasing, the malt-forward sweetness, the strange brown depth, was precisely the thing the drinkers loved. He spent the rest of his life in the brewery. By 1931, he was managing director of Newcastle Breweries. He stayed in post through the Second World War, through ingredient shortages and the wartime taxes that lightened the strength and the colour of every British beer, including his own, through the post-war recovery. Through everything. He became chairman. He took the CBE and a presidency of the Institute of Brewing. He died in Newcastle on the 22nd of March, 1973. by which time his unsuccessful copy of Bass had become a regional totem, an export curiosity, and the bottled flagship of one of Britain's biggest brewing companies. He never lived to see it leave the city. Chapter 3. Broon Ale Tune. Ben Wilkinson, who would grow up to be head brewer at Wylam, remembers stepping off the bus by St James's Park as a boy. What hit him first wasn't the football ground, or the cathedral, or the river. It was a smell, warm, sweet, malty in a way that almost felt edible, as if the air itself had been steeped in something nourishing. "That's the Broon on the boil," somebody told him. He never forgot it. That smell came from the Tyne Brewery's vents. On certain days when wind and water and the brewing cycle aligned, the vapour from the mash tons lifted across Gallowgate and settled over the centre of the city. People who lived in the West End knew when a brew was on. People who worked in offices in the city centre knew. People who came to watch Newcastle United play on the Saturday afternoons that organised Tyneside life knew most of all because the Gallowgate end of St James's Park, the stand closest to the brewery, sat directly under the drift. The Newcastle Brown Ale smell on a match day was, by general agreement, almost as enjoyable as the football. Sometimes more so. The football came and went. The smell was reliable. Inside the brewery, on a typical day in the 1970s, the operation worked at a scale that needs setting down. By 1972, the Tyne Brewery was producing over 1 million barrels of beer a year. Not all of it. Brown, McEwen's, Younger's Lines, draft lagers, kegs of bitter for the Tide estate. But by 1994, when the company looked at its output figures, a quarter of everything coming out of the Tyne Brewery was Newcastle Brown Ale. 1 in every 4 barrels. The brewery had effectively become the world's brown ale factory, with a sideline in other beers. Brewers and chemists ran the mash. Coopers, by the 70s a dying trade, still maintained some of the casking equipment. Draymen ran the lorries that carried filled kegs out into the city. Bottling line workers, mostly women, kept the production end running at the speed the wholesalers demanded. A specialist crew handled the export packaging. The cases of brown ale, destined for the merchant ships sailing out of the Tyne to ports that had been drinking Newcastle's beer since before the First World War. The product had a name, and the name had a second name. Broon, in the Geordie tongue, was the most commonly used. But it had a private nickname too. The dog, from the phrase, half joking, half evasive, that a husband used to a wife who wanted him to stay home. "I'm just off to see a man about a dog." Translated, "I'm going to the pub." The Newcastle Brown Ale at the bottom of that errand became, by easy extension, the dog itself. Walking the dog meant a quick nip out for a bottle. You drank it from a glass. Not a pint glass. That wasn't the ritual. The proper vessel was a half-pint schooner, the so-called Wellington glass, dimpled and short. You poured the bottle into the schooner in stages, never all at once, topping up to keep a head of foam on the beer throughout the drink. A bottle gave you several toppings up. A session drinker would have a row of bottles standing at his elbow, waiting their turn. The ritual was specific, and the ritual was the point. Anyone who poured a brown ale straight into a pint glass and downed it had not understood the thing they were drinking. The drinkers were specific too. Shipyard men coming off the Wall's End or Walker shift, still in their overalls. The river's particular cold and noise stuck in their bones. Miners up from Durham collieries, Easington, Hordern, Merton, Easington Lane, their faces still showing the boundary line where the pit dust had been washed off and the natural skin began. Steelworkers down from Consett before Consett was killed. Engineers and turners from the Elswick Vickers works. Heavy industrial labour, drinking heavy industrial beer. A second institution supplied them. The Northern Club's Federation Brewery, founded by the Tyneside working men's clubs themselves in 1919, after a failed first attempt involving a derelict brewery in Alnwick, brewed and bottled beer that the clubs sold to their members at cost. The Federation and the Tyne Brewery were the twin pillars of Tyneside drinking, and the Federation's existence is part of what made brown ale's spread possible. Working men's clubs across Northumberland, Durham, the Tyne Valley and the colliery villages stocked Newcastle Brown alongside their own Federation beer. The two breweries were not rivals so much as partners in supplying a culture. That culture had texture. The writer Emmy Harrison West, who grew up on Tyneside before deciding to write about it for a living, captured the texture as well as anyone has. "Bitter and malty," she wrote of the brown. like rocket fuel. But it was ours. It was my city's bread and butter. That possessive, ours, is the thing that's hardest to translate. It was never just a product. The blue star on the label was a piece of civic identification. To carry a bottle of Brown across a bar was to display a quiet allegiance, the way a Newcastle United scarf displayed it more loudly. The brewery was 3 minutes' walk from St. James's Park, and on match days the two structures functioned as a single emotional building. Football to the south, beer to the north, the smell binding them into one experience, the beer mat on every Tyneside table soaked through with the same foam. And outside Newcastle, the brand was beginning to do something nobody at the brewery, not Porter, not the chemists, not the directors who had asked for a popular bottled ale in 1924, had quite anticipated. It was beginning to travel. Chapter 4. The one and only goes to America. The thing about regional beers in 20th century Britain is that most of them died regional. Local strength was no protection against the consolidation that swept through British brewing in the second half of the century. The closing of the small breweries, the absorption of the medium ones, the emergence of a handful of national giants who carried their flagship products into every pub from Penzance to Aberdeen and left no shelf space for anyone else. Newcastle Brown survived consolidation by getting bigger than it. In 1960, Newcastle breweries merged with Scottish brewers, itself the product of a 1931 merger between William Younger and Company and McEwan's, the two great Edinburgh houses. The new company called itself Scottish and Newcastle. From that day forward, Newcastle Brown Ale was no longer a regional product carried on the strength of the Tyne Brewery alone. It was the bottled flagship of an Edinburgh and Newcastle group with the distribution muscle of two countries on the way to becoming one of the largest brewers in the United Kingdom. The effect was immediate. The beer that Walson's shipyard men had been drinking since the late 20s was now available, in roughly the same brown bottle, with roughly the same star on the label, to drinkers in Aberdeen, in Glasgow, in Belfast, in Birmingham, in Bristol, in Cardiff. UK sales climbed steadily and then steeply through the 60s and into the early 70s. By 1972, the Tyne Brewery's million barrels a year figure included a brown ale share that was reaching every corner of Britain. The one and only slogan was no longer aspirational. It was, for premium bottled brown ale in the United Kingdom, simply a fact. Porter saw most of it. He had become chairman, taken the CBE, served as president of the Institute of Brewing, watched the company that had given him his first job in 1909 swell into a national power. He died in 1973 in Newcastle, with the brewery he had built running at peak capacity and his beer being shipped to every part of the country. What he didn't see was the second wave. Sometime in the 1980s, in a development that nobody at the brewery had planned, Newcastle Brown Ale became a cult product. First in British student unions, where the combination of strength, sweetness, brownness, low price, and the romance of an industrial North identity made it a fashionable order among undergraduates who were performing, perhaps for the first time, an idea of working-class authenticity through their drinking. The peak of that fashion came in 1993, when a bottle of Newcastle Brown Ale was nominated to stand as a candidate in the Southampton University Students' Union election. The bottle came fourth. It beat several human beings. Then the cult crossed the Atlantic. In the American college bars of the late 80s and through the 90s, Newcastle Brown, Nuki Brown, as it became known to the same drinkers who had previously been ordering Bud Light, turned into a fashionable import. It sat on back bar lists alongside Guinness and Bass and Heineken as one of the few foreign beers an American college student could be expected to recognise. By the late 90s, 2/3 of all Newcastle Brown Ale brewed was being drunk somewhere other than Britain. The brewery on Gallowgate was, increasingly, producing for export. For an entire generation of American drinkers, particularly through the mid-90s and into the early 2000s, Nuki Brown also did something culturally important. It was a stepping stone. A drinker raised on light American lager who found themselves enjoying the malt-forward sweetness of Newcastle Brown was a drinker whose palate had been opened. From there, the same drinker would find their way to amber ales, to British bitters, to the early American craft beers that were beginning to appear in the same bars. The American craft beer revolution had many parents. Newcastle Brown was one of them. Back home, the brewery's owners were riding their own wave. By 1985, Scottish and Newcastle was the fifth largest brewer in Britain. In 1995, it bought Courage and became the largest, owning around 2,500 pubs alongside its breweries. The company was no longer regional. It was no longer national. It was about to become continental and then global. And in the middle of all this, on the chest of one football team, the beer became something it had never quite been before, a piece of explicit civic regalia. Newcastle United started carrying the Newcastle Brown Blue Star on their shirts in 1990. From 1995 to 1997, the era of Kevin Keegan's entertainers, the most romantic Newcastle United side in the modern history of the club, the team of Alan Shearer, David Ginola, Les Ferdinand, Peter Beardsley, Rob Lee, the side that nearly won the Premier League in '96 and broke the world transfer record for Shearer in '97. The Newcastle shirt didn't carry the Blue Star alone. It carried the full Newcastle Brown Ale bottle label. The whole thing. Bottle, star, name, skyline, medals. Sponsorship had crossed the line from advertisement into something resembling sacrament. The city's footballers wore the city's beer over their hearts. There was one place they couldn't wear it. In the spring of 1997, in a UEFA Cup tie against Monaco played in France, the team had to swap out the brown ale shirt for one carrying a Centre Parcs logo. French law banned alcohol sponsorship on televised sport, and the lads of Tyneside found themselves, for one night only, advertising holiday parks. Geordie supporters in the stands took it as a temporary indignity. Their team, their beer, their identity, flickering off the chest for 90 minutes because of someone else's law. They got the proper shirt back the following weekend. That image, Shearer in the brown ale shirt, fixed the relationship between beer and city more powerfully than any advert ever could. It said, "This is who we are." The beer was the badge. The badge was the city. The city was, in the imagined geography of every Newcastle supporter in every pub, from Byker to Benton, the centre of the world. And the world very soon was about to make it official. Chapter 5. Champagne of the Tyne. In February of 2000, the European Commission did something for Newcastle Brown Ale that nobody had thought to ask the European Commission for 60 years earlier. It granted the Beer Protected Geographical Indication, PGI, the same legal classification, under the same EU regulation, introduced in 1992, that protected champagne. That protected Parma ham. That protected Melton Mowbray pork pies, Cornish pasties, Stilton cheese. The classification existed to recognise products whose identity was so tied to a place that allowing them to be made elsewhere would constitute a fraud against the place itself. From February 2000, in the eyes of European law, Newcastle Brown Ale could only legally be brewed in Newcastle upon Tyne. The BBC reported the decision plainly. The beer, it said, was protected from imitations and could not be brewed anywhere other than in the northeast of England. There was something faintly absurd about needing a Brussels bureaucracy to certify what every Geordie had always known, that the Brown belonged to the Tyne. But absurdity didn't matter. What mattered was that the bond between beer and birthplace was now a matter of statute. The brewers themselves, on the Gallowgate site, had asked for the protection. They had explained in regulatory paperwork that ran to dozens of pages the unique geographical, historical and cultural ties between the product and the city. They had been awarded the highest form of place protection that European law could confer. It was a trophy. For the city, it was the highest point ever reached in the relationship between the beer and the place. For Scottish and Newcastle, it was a marketing windfall, a free legal endorsement of the brand's authenticity that no advertising agency could have manufactured. By the late 90s, Newcastle Brown was already, by the company's own measurement, the most widely distributed alcoholic product in both pubs and off-licenses in the United Kingdom. The beer was on every shelf, in every supermarket. It was on every back bar. It was on the chest of a Premier League football team. It was being drunk in dozens of countries and would soon be drunk in more. And now, on top of all that, it was a champagne tier protected product. The beer writer Pete Brown, looking at the figures a few years later, captured the international scale better than anyone. 2/3 of all Newcastle Brown Ale, he noted, was being drunk in the United States. Only about 1/10 was being supped on Tyneside, the product's core audience, the heart of the customer base, the people on whom the brand's future depended. was, in his phrase, at least 3,000 miles from its source. That figure, properly understood, is the warning bell. A brand whose name is tied to a city and whose customers are mostly on a different continent has a quiet logical problem. The link between the place and the product, which is the whole of the value the customer is paying for, depends on the place still being involved in the making. As long as the link holds, the brand works. The moment somebody in a boardroom decides the link is more trouble than it's worth, that the city is a sentimental tax on the bottom line, the bond becomes a liability rather than an asset. The PGI was the strongest possible statement that, in the eyes of European law, that link could never be broken without permission. In the boardrooms at Scottish and Newcastle, the company was riding higher than it ever had. It was the last domestically owned large-scale brewer in Britain. It had survived an early 90s takeover attempt from the Australian conglomerate Elders I&L, beaten back in part by the company's own loyal northeast customers, who plastered Tyneside with "Keep Us on Top" posters, featuring an inverted Newcastle Brown label. The company that owned the beer was, for that brief window, the People's Company. But Scottish and Newcastle's strategy was not really to remain the People's Company. It was to become a continental and then a global brewer. Across the late 90s and into the new century, the company bought Kronenbourg in France, took a half share of Baltic Beverages Holding to acquire the Russian Baltica brand, bought the Finnish brewer Hartwall, picked up the Bulmers cider business with Strongbow and Scrumpy Jack. The strategy of growth by acquisition had a logic. The logic, applied year after year, also produced a particular kind of pressure inside the company. Money spent on Kronenbourg in Strasbourg was money not spent on the Tyne Brewery in Newcastle. Capital that flowed to Russia did not flow to Gallowgate. Analysts began to whisper that the UK cost base was too high. The Tyne Brewery, for all its history, was operating below the industry's productivity standards. The newly built bottling plant, opened in 1999 at a cost of £16.6 million, a state-of-the-art facility built specifically to keep the Tyne Brewery competitive into the new century, was barely run in. For a year or so after the PGI was granted, none of this was visible to the drinker. The bottle on the shelf carried the new protected status as a small legal note. The Blue Star was unchanged. The beer was unchanged. Shearer had stopped wearing the bottle on his shirt. The sponsorship had moved on, but the brown was still everywhere. 2000, 2001, 2002. The Tyne Brewery hummed. Then, on the 22nd of April 2004, in a conference room in Edinburgh, the chairman of Scottish Courage stood up to make an announcement. Chapter 6. The Cost Base. To understand why a healthy business shuts the brewery that makes its most famous product, you have to step back from Edinburgh and look at the wider brewing landscape that surrounded it. For most of the 20th century, British brewing operated on the tied house model. The big brewers owned the pubs that sold their beer. Bass owned thousands. Whitbread owned thousands. Scottish and Newcastle owned thousands. A drinker walking into a Bass pub drank Bass. A drinker walking into a Whitbread pub drank Whitbread. The system kept the breweries rich and the choice on the bar limited. In 1989, the Monopolies and Mergers Commission decided this had gone on long enough. Its report, The Supply of Beer, found that the so-called Big Six, Allied, Bass, Grand Metropolitan, Imperial, Scottish and Newcastle, and Whitbread, were responsible for 3/4 of British beer output and owned 3/4 of the tied houses. Bass alone had over 7,000 pubs. Whitbread had 6,500. Courage had 5,100. The government's response, the Supply of Beer Tied Estate Order, forced the big brewers to sell off large portions of their pub estates. The beer orders, as they became known, didn't just reshape the industry, they detonated it. Over the following decade, the certainties that had organised British brewing for a century came apart. Some companies got out of pubs and stayed in brewing. Some got out of brewing and stayed in pubs. Some did neither, and disappeared. The pub estates passed into new entities called pubcos. The brewing groups consolidated into a smaller and smaller number of larger and larger players. By 2000, regional brewing had been hollowed out, and the survivors were behaving less like brewers and more like global beverage corporations with brewing in their portfolios. Scottish and Newcastle was one of the survivors. By the early 2000s, the company that had begun the 1960s as a Scottish and Tyneside regional player had been transformed into a sprawling international business. Sir Brian Stewart, who had joined the company in 1976 and risen to be chief executive in 1991 and chairman from 2000, was the man steering it. Stewart's strategy was clear enough: match the global scale of Heineken, Carlsberg, Anheuser-Busch, and SAB Miller, or be eaten by one of them. The company bought Kronenbourg in 2000. It took a half share of Baltic Beverages Holding to get into the Russian and Baltic market, where the Baltica brand was the dominant force. It bought Hartwall in Finland in 2002. It bought the Bulmers cider business in 2003, picking up Strongbow, Scrumpy Jack and Woodpecker in one move. The company that had emerged from a brewery on Gallowgate now had operations from Murmansk to Marseille. In 2003, Tony Froggatt arrived as chief executive. Froggatt was Australian. He had run Coca-Cola, Amatil in Asia, and he came to Scottish and Newcastle with a brief that was barely concealed. The UK arm was running below the productivity standards of the European competitors. The fixed costs were too high. The breweries were old. Something would have to give. In February of 2004, Froggatt's company closed the Fountain Brewery in Edinburgh. Fountain had been brewing McEwan's and Younger's beers since the 1850s. Edinburgh lost its last working brewery in a single press release. The closure of Fountain should have been the warning. For anyone watching from Newcastle, it was the warning. If the Scottish founding half of Scottish and Newcastle could have its brewery shut, the Newcastle half had no special exemption. The decision logic was the same on both sides of the border. The breweries were old, the cost base was too high, the brand could be made somewhere cheaper. And there was something else. In 1999, Scottish and Newcastle had spent £16.6 million on a brand new bottling plant at the Tyne Brewery. The investment had been presented at the time as a commitment to the future of brewing on Gallowgate. The new lines were the most modern in Britain. The plant was supposed to keep the Tyne Brewery competitive into the new century. 5 years later, with the equipment barely worked in, the conference rooms in Edinburgh had quietly accepted that the investment had been wasted. The plant would be closed before it ever earned out. The Newcastle figures, on a spreadsheet stripped of everything that was not pounds per hectolitre, didn't work. Inside the brewery, the workers knew something was coming. Brewers always know. The orders for new equipment dry up first. Maintenance gets delayed. Bottling line shifts get cut. The senior managers stop making eye contact in the canteen. By early 2004, the Tyne Brewery had the atmosphere of a wake being held while the dead man was still in the room. On the 22nd of April, 2004, the chairman of Scottish Courage, the UK brewing division of Scottish and Newcastle, gave the family the news. Chapter 7. Last Orders on the Tyne. His name was John Dunsmore. He was a Scottish and Newcastle lifer who had risen through the company to run its UK brewing arm, and on the morning of the 22nd of April, he stood up to explain the logic of a decision that had been made above him and that he had been chosen to deliver. The Tyne Brewery, he said, would close. Production of Newcastle Brown Ale, McEwan's beers, and the rest of the Scottish Courage UK volume would move across the river to a new combined facility at Dunston in Gateshead. Scottish and Newcastle would purchase the Federation Brewery in Dunston for £7.2 million. The two breweries would merge under a new entity called Newcastle Federation Breweries. The whole transition would be completed by spring 2005. Both breweries, Dunsmore explained, had been operating below industry standards of capacity and efficiency. By joining forces, Scottish Courage and the Federation would be able to preserve a home for these brands on Tyneside. Preserve a home on Tyneside. That was the phrase. The new combined business would employ around 170 people. More than 100 jobs would go. The company hoped, in the standard language, that as many of those losses as possible could be achieved through voluntary redundancy. Across Newcastle, the response was immediate and bitter. Camera's brewing industry director, a man called John Holland, gave the verdict that summed up what most of the North East felt. The loss of the brewery, he said, was a blow. It represented another nail in the coffin for the British brewing industry. Scottish and Newcastle was now very much a global company, but its roots lay in Newcastle, and the company would do well to remember that. Inside the Tyne Brewery, the workforce had a year to absorb what had happened to them. Some took voluntary redundancy and went. Others stayed on to wind the operation down. The last brews were scheduled for the spring of 2005. The brown ale itself was treated, in those final months, with a particular kind of ceremony. The brewery decided that the very last bottles to come off the Tyne Brewery line would be marked. They would carry a commemorative label noting that they were the last bottles ever produced at the place that had made them since 1927. 3,000 of these bottles were set aside as the final run. Some were given to long-serving workers. Some were saved for the brewery archive. Some, inevitably, were drunk on the day they came off the line by men who had spent their working lives at the brewery and were never going to drink another brown ale that had been brewed there. The label read, 121 years of brewing history, last bottles produced at the Tyne Brewery. The arithmetic on that label was a quiet decision in itself. 121 years, measured back to 1884, the year the first brewing license was issued on the modern Tyne Brewery site. The label could have read 78 years, measuring back to the launch of Newcastle Brown in 1927. It could have read 235 years, measuring back to the founding of John Barras and Company in 1770. The brewery chose 121, a round enough number, long enough to carry weight, not so long that the corporate descendant would be accused of having presided over the destruction of something that predated the Industrial Revolution. The last brew was made, the last bottles came off the line, the lights stayed on for a few more weeks while the equipment was decommissioned. Then, in the late spring of 2005, the Tyne Brewery on Gallowgate stopped producing beer for the first time in over a century. What Dunsmore had called preserving a home on Tyneside was, in the literal sense, true. The beer was still being brewed in the northeast, just on the wrong side of the river, 3/4 of a mile across the Tyne from where it had been made for 78 years, in a brewery that had originally been built to supply working men's clubs rather than to bottle the city's most famous export. The Brown was now in Gateshead. The PGI it had been awarded in 2000 stipulated that Newcastle Brown Ale could only be brewed in Newcastle upon Tyne. Somewhere in Scottish and Newcastle's legal department, somebody had noticed. Chapter 8. Unprotecting Newcastle. The logical conclusion of moving production across the river was that Scottish and Newcastle had two options: move back or change the law. The company applied to Brussels. The application was lodged through the proper channels. It was made under the EU's Protected Designations Framework, the same framework, in reverse, that had granted the protection in the first place. The company that owned the beer was now asking the European Commission to cancel the protection that the city had won 4 years earlier. The reasoning offered was logistical, commercial flexibility, the need for the manufacturer to be able to make production decisions that the geographical restriction was inhibiting. On the 9th of August 2007, Commission Regulation No. 952 of 2007 was published in the Official Journal of the European Union. The regulation, in 3 short paragraphs of regulatory prose, cancelled the registration of Newcastle Brown Ale as a protected geographical indication. The legal bond between the beer and its birthplace was dissolved. After 7 years, the company's public line at the time was that this should not be read as a precursor to anything. This wasn't, a spokesman explained, the trigger to move abroad. The company had chosen to keep Newcastle Brown in the northeast. That would stay. Pete Brown, the beer writer, was the loudest of the contemporary critics. He pointed out the basic absurdity of the move. Here was a beer called Newcastle Brown Ale. It had a picture of Newcastle on the label. It had been awarded Champagne tier protection on the precise grounds that it was inseparable from the place it was named after. And the company that owned it was asking Brussels to take that protection away voluntarily at the very moment when premium bottled ale was the fastest growing segment in the British beer market, and Newcastle Brown was its leader. Brown's verdict, in language that managed to be both polite and unforgiving, was that the decision was insulting. Insulting to the drinkers who had built the brand. Insulting to the city that had given it its name. Insulting to the workers who had brewed it for nearly 80 years. He had a more direct phrase for it too, when he was not being polite. He called it really fucking stupid. Camera echoed the analysis. So did local newspapers. So did MPs from across the northeast. The decision to revoke the PGI was in the public mind the moment Scottish and Newcastle stopped being a Tyneside company and started being a portfolio manager. It was also the moment that the bond between the beer and the city, the bond Porter and Jones had created in the experimental room of the Tyne Brewery in the mid-1920s, the bond that the European Commission had recognised in 2000, became, in the cold language of brand strategy, optional. What Brussels had granted, the company had asked Brussels to take back. The lawyers had earned their fees, and in October of that same year, an even larger letter arrived in Edinburgh, addressed to Sir Brian Stewart and his board. Chapter 9. The 7.8 billion hijack. The letter was from Heineken. Heineken had been thinking about Scottish and Newcastle for some time. So had Carlsberg. The two companies, the Dutch giant and the Danish giant, wanted different parts of the same target. Heineken wanted the Western European brands, including Newcastle Brown and the UK business. Carlsberg wanted the Russian operations, the Baltika brand, the half-share in Baltic Beverages Holding. Between them, they could carve up Britain's last large independent brewer. In October 2007, they made a joint approach through a bid vehicle called Sunrise Acquisitions. The first offer was rejected. So was the second. Each refusal pushed the price upward. By January, the offer had reached £8 a share, a total of £7.8 billion in cash, a price that John Dunsmore, by now Scottish and Newcastle's chief executive, judged could no longer, reasonably, be turned down. On the 25th of January 2008, the board of Scottish and Newcastle accepted. On the 31st of March, the shareholders voted to agree. On the 29th of April, the deal completed. Scottish and Newcastle, Britain's last domestically owned large-scale brewer, ceased to exist as an independent company. The carve-up worked as planned. Carlsberg took the Russian, French, Greek, Chinese and Vietnamese operations. Heineken took the UK business, including Newcastle Brown Ale, along with Ireland, Portugal, Finland, Belgium, India and the United States. Jean-François van Boxmeer, the chairman and chief executive of Heineken, explained the strategic logic. This was a significant strategic step for Heineken. It gave the company undisputed leadership in Europe and created significant opportunities in profitable markets to grow the premium Heineken brand. Profitable markets. Premium Heineken brand. The language was the language of every brewing portfolio transaction of the period. There was no mention of Newcastle. There was no mention of the Tyne Brewery, by then already 2 years closed. There was no mention of the Federation Brewery, by then producing the brown ale on the wrong side of the river. There was no mention of the city. The press release was about leadership and opportunity. Dunsmore, who had defended the company to the end, including by pursuing legal options against Carlsberg over the structure of the Baltic Beverages joint venture, left at the completion. He had been chief executive for barely 6 months when the deal completed. His exit interview, in the way these things go, was published with the standard expressions of confidence in the new owners and the future of the business. In private, he was less measured. "I wanted to be in charge of Scottish and Newcastle," he said, "but I don't want to sound sour." The British trade union UNIT, which represented the bulk of Scottish and Newcastle's 3,300 UK workers, was less polite. Ian McLean, the union's national officer, sent the public signal of what his members feared. There would be a meeting with Scottish and Newcastle the following week. The union would be looking for Carlsberg and Heineken to guarantee the security of their members' jobs. The guarantees were the standard guarantees of the period. They held, in the period immediately following the takeover, in the way that guarantees of that kind tend to. The UK business kept the Scottish and Newcastle name on its letterhead for another year and a half, in part to manage the perception of continuity. Then, on the 23rd of November 2009, Heineken UK Limited was the new name on the door. The Scottish and Newcastle brand, the company that had been formed in 1960 in a merger that had given Newcastle Brown Ale its national distribution, was retired. The beer Porter had created in 1927 was now a line item in a Dutch portfolio. Chapter 10. Sir Bobby pushes the button. The Tyne Brewery site had been sold in 2004, almost as soon as the closure was announced. The buyer was a consortium, Newcastle University, Newcastle City Council, and the Regional Development Agency, One North East. 14 acres of central Newcastle, the brewery's footprint, were to become the heart of a project called Newcastle Science City. Before any of that could be built, the brewery had to come down. Demolition began on the 8th of March 2007. The BBC ran a report under the headline, "Time Called on Historic Landmark." The buildings closest to the road went first, the office blocks, the older warehouses, the parts of the site that could be brought down with a long-reach excavator, and a few weeks of patient destruction. The brewing buildings themselves, The towers and the vessels were stripped from the inside before they were taken down. Copper, steel, stainless. The high-value scrap was lifted out and sent to merchants. The biggest structure on the site was the bottling plant. It had been built in the 1960s, a reinforced concrete cube 60 metres square and 40 metres high, opposite St James's Park, the building that produced the Newcastle Brown Ale that Newcastle United supporters watched their team beneath. The bottling plant could not be brought down by excavator. It had to be imploded. The job went to a firm called Controlled Group. The engineering went to Applied Science International. The structural engineer running the demolition, a man called Rob Clark, calculated the loads, the cuts, the timing. 250 kilograms of explosives were placed at specific points throughout the building. The cuts were prepared. The exclusion zone was drawn. The press were invited. On the 22nd of June 2008, a Sunday, the day when the streets around Gallowgate were quietest, Sir Bobby Robson pressed the button. Robson, Newcastle's man, the son of a County Durham miner, a boy from Sacriston who had grown up watching Newcastle United from the Gallowgate end, a footballer who had played for them, a manager who had managed England and then come home to manage Newcastle, the club he had supported all his life. By 2008, he was 75 years old, dying of cancer, the most loved figure in the city's modern history. They chose him. A crowd had gathered behind the barriers. The countdown started at 10. The Chronicle photographer found his angle. When the count reached 0, the explosives detonated in sequence, and the bottling plant came down in the controlled way that bottling plants come down when the engineering is right. 250 kilograms of charges made light work, as the Chronicle reporter wrote afterwards, of the 50-year-old red brick building. A column of dust rose over Gallowgate and drifted, in the wrong direction now, where the malt smell used to drift. Rob Clark watched his calculations come true. The similarities between the predicted collapse and the actual collapse, he said, were impressive. The BBC's headline that evening was Sir Bobby Blast's Brown Ale plant. The pun did the work that the eulogy could not. The most beloved football figure in the city had been brought in to detonate the building that had made the city's most beloved beer. The civic ceremony and the civic grief were, in that single image, the same thing. Robson died 14 months later, in July 2009. By then, the demolition that started with the bottling plant was almost complete, and the second blow was on its way. On the 13th of October 2009, Heineken's UK operations director, a man called Paul Hoffman, announced that the Federation Brewery in Dunston, the brewery that had been bought to preserve the beer's northeast home only 5 years earlier, would close. Production would move to the John Smith's Brewery in Tadcaster, North Yorkshire, 2 hours south on the A1. The stated reasons were the standard reasons: falling UK beer sales, overcapacity in the brewery network. Dunston, Hoffman said, was running at only 60% of capacity. 63 jobs would go. Sales of Newcastle Brown Ale, at that moment, were at record highs. Hoffman delivered the line about the difficult day. "Clearly this is a sad day," he said, "but the proposal to close Dunston is not a decision we have taken lightly." David Cleland, the Tyne Bridge MP, whose constituency included the brewery, said what the rest of the North East was thinking. It was all very sad. It was the end of an era. He was disappointed with the company because of the promises they had previously made. He thought it was damaging to their brand. James Ramsbotham, the chief executive of the North East Chamber of Commerce, found a phrase that landed. The closure of the Federation Brewery, he said, would be mourned by all who recognise this landmark on Gateshead's skyline. Mourned by all. Mourned, in particular, by the working men's clubs that had built the Federation in the first place. The Tyneside clubs that had pooled their money in 1919 to set up their own brewery and brew their own beer at cost. Heineken's name on the closure of a brewery the working men of Tyneside had built was, as the Morning Advertiser dryly observed, a disservice to history. Brewing ended at Dunston at the end of May 2010. The 17-acre site was sold in September 2012 for £3 million. The Federation name lingered for a while on a sign outside an industrial estate. Newcastle Brown Ale was no longer brewed anywhere in the northeast of England. 83 years after Porter had launched it, and 140 years after John Barris had begun brewing on the Tyneside side of the river, the beer named after Newcastle was being made 2 hours south, in Yorkshire, in a brewery whose first job was producing John Smith's. Chapter 11. The Zombie in the Blue Star. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. In 2017, Heineken moved some of the production for the American market out of Tadcaster. The new home for the export brown was Zoeterwoud, in the Netherlands, Heineken's own brewery in its own backyard, a 40-minute drive from Amsterdam. The justification, as ever, was logistics. Shorter order lead times, faster Atlantic shipping, the ability for American distributors to buy by the pallet rather than the container. Newcastle Brown Ale, for the American drinker, was now brewed in Holland. 2 years later, in 2019, Heineken stopped importing the Dutch-brewed version into the United States altogether. In its place, the company launched a new American-brewed version, made by its own subsidiary Lagunitas at sites in Chicago and Petaluma. The new American Newcastle Brown was a different recipe, more heavily hopped, using American Centennial and Chinook hops, designed to fit American taste. By most accounts of people who knew the original, it didn't taste like Newcastle Brown Ale at all. It tasted like an American craft brewery's idea of what an American drinker thought Newcastle Brown ought to taste like. The Blue Star was on the label. The Tyne Bridge was on the label. The skyline of Newcastle was on the label. The beer inside the bottle had not been within 3,000 miles of any of those things. Through all of this, the marketing kept doing its job. In April 2012, Heineken had launched a campaign in the United States built around what the agency Droga 5 had identified as the brand's central asset, Geordie authenticity. The campaign was called No Bollocks. Its premise was that Newcastle Brown was the honest beer, the unpretentious beer, the beer that didn't try to fool you with marketing tricks. Charles Van Es, the brand director, gave interviews explaining the strategy. If you look at the Geordies, he told one trade publication, they're very friendly, down to earth, they don't take themselves too seriously, and they tell it like it is. We want to be transparent about the fact that we're marketing to you, and the fact that our beer comes from England. The campaign sold beer. The beer was no longer made in Newcastle. The beer was no longer made in the Northeast. For American drinkers, the beer was no longer made in England. The brand was now a costume. Back on Gallowgate, the Science City kept going up. On the 25th of February 2015, the universities and science minister, a man called Greg Clark, came north to open the development formally. It had been renamed by then, Science Central first, then Newcastle Helix, a £350 million joint project of Newcastle City Council and Newcastle University, occupying 24 acres of central Newcastle that had once been Elswick Colliery, then the Tyne Brewery, and were now to be the knowledge economy. The buildings have names: the Spark, the Catalyst, which houses the National Innovation Centre for Data and the National Innovation Centre for Aging, the Biosphere, the Lumen, the Frederick Douglass Centre, the Urban Sciences Building, the Quay. The multi-storey car park is called the Garage. There is a hotel. There are student apartments. For a long time, after the brewery came down, the old brewery visitor centre survived. A single fragment, standing on its own, the last building from the brewing era left standing on the site. It's gone now too. The recipe of the beer itself changed in 2015. The caramel colouring that Porter and Jones had specified in their original 1927 formulation, and that the brewery had used continuously for 88 years, was replaced with roasted malt. The change was made because of American consumer concerns about the chemistry of caramel colouring. The brown was browner now because of how the malts had been kilned, not because of what had been added afterwards. Porter would have understood the chemistry. Whether he would have understood the surrender, in his own beer's recipe, to an American food additive controversy is a different question. In 2025, Heineken USA brought the original recipe back to the United States as a UK import, brewed once again at Tadcaster, shipped across the Atlantic in proper bottles. Adina McMahon, Heineken USA's Director of Innovation, made the announcement with the tone of someone delivering good news. We're bringing back the original recipe. Bringing back the original recipe, 20 years after they shut down the brewery that had made the original recipe, in a brewery that was not in Newcastle, 200 miles south of the place the beer was named for. The wheel kept turning. In Newcastle itself, in the city the beer is supposed to be named after, the brewing of brown ale never stopped. It just stopped happening in the corporate version of it. Wylam Brewery on the edge of the city brews a beer called Painting the Toon Broon, a deliberate homage that gets shipped from Tyneside to tap rooms in London. Sunderland's Maxim Brewery, founded by ex-Vaux men who had decided that they didn't want city slickers to get hold of the old recipes and let them disappear, makes Double Maxim to the 1901 Vaux specification, the very beer that was launched to compete with Newcastle Brown back in 1928. Firebrick, Tyne Bank, Newcastle Brewing's Ausburn Brown Ale. The local independents have picked up the torch the corporate brand let drop. The skill never left Tyneside. The capital did. The skill was always going to be there, waiting, for whoever could afford to use it. Ben Wilkinson, the brewer who as a child stepped off the bus by St. James's Park and was hit by the warm, sweet smell of the Broon on the boil, brews professionally now. So does Mark Anderson at Maxim. They remember what their city tasted like when it had a brewery making its own beer in the middle of it. They make sure their children's generation will have something to remember. The smell over the Gallowgate is gone. The brewery is gone. The PGI is gone. The company is gone. Sir Bobby is gone. The bottling plant is gone. The visitor centre is gone. The Federation is gone. The Blue Star travels on bottles that have not been within 300 miles of the city the star was designed to represent. But the city remembers. The drinkers remember. The brewers remember. The half-pint schooner sits on the bar at Wylam, full of a beer the head brewer learned to want by walking past the Tyne Brewery as a boy, the recipe of a regional working man's beer that conquered the United States and was then taken away from the people who had built it, is being quietly rewritten in independent breweries across Northumberland and Durham by people who never agreed that the bond between a beer and a place was a logistical inconvenience. The Brown is in the Netherlands. The Brown is in Yorkshire. The Brown, for a while, was in Chicago. The Brown, in its proper home, is in the hands of brewers who know what their grandfathers drank and what their grandfathers' fathers brewed. That smell is gone. The city is not.